Syrian Kurdish-led forces say they're now in control of the Syrian border town Tal Abyad after 2 days of intense fighting and U.S. coalition-led airstrikes. It's considered a major setback for ISIL fighters. The militant group relied on the supply route between Tal Abyad and the stronghold of Raqqa as a way to move guns, oil and foreign fighters into Syria. CCTV's Jim Spellman joins us now. He's been following the story. And Jim, how significant is the recapture of this border town?
Well, look, not only have these Kurdish fighters and these allied rebels taken this important town along the border, as you mentioned, potentially cutting off some supply routes used by ISIL, but by all accounts, this was a quick and decisive victory. The intense part of the battle took just 3 days. The Kurdish fighters were also able to clear surrounding areas of mines and IEDs. That's important for potentially holding the town. This comes after 2 weeks of airstrikes by the U.S.-led coalition. So military leaders here in the U.S. are saying this is a validation of the U.S. strategy against ISIL. It also, at least to a small degree, knocks down this mythology that's been building up around the Islamic State, showing that it is possible to defeat ISIL, or at least slow their progress. But look, we've seen towns in Iraq go back and forth between ISIL and Iraqi forces, so we have to see if this holds. ISIL will likely try to establish some new supply routes, and they still hold huge swaths of land. So premature to consider this some sort of turning point, but still an important victory.
And Jim, what's the next move for these Kurdish fighters?
Clearly, they're emboldened, and they say their next target is Raqqa, Syria, the de facto capital of the Islamic State, headquarters of some of their leadership. That will be a much more difficult fight, though. We do know, though, that cutting off those supply routes at Tal Abyad could help, but they're going to see much more resistance from a much more fortified and heavily armed ISIL there in Raqqa, Anand.
ISIL took Ramadi in Iraq's Anbar province last month, and it's been a year since the loss of Iraq's second largest city, that was Mosul. How has ISIL become so powerful?
Well, look, in Syria, there was this vacuum created by the ongoing civil war between rebel groups and the Assad-led government. The Islamic State found fertile ground there to establish what they claim to be their caliphate. As they moved into Iraq, they frankly met little resistance from Iraqi forces. All this seemed to catch Western intelligence agencies by surprise. As opposed to earlier groups like al-Qaeda, the Islamic State has sought to hold ground and even govern, and they have been successful at that for longer than many in the U.S. intelligence and military communities thought possible. With those footholds established, they've been able to take hostages, they crank out these videos, online magazines, and recruit fighters from around the world to come to Syria and Iraq, or to launch lone wolf attacks back in their own countries. They've essentially breathed new life into the worldwide jihadist movement, and the U.S.-led coalition, they've been hammering away with these airstrikes, but there's been such resistance here in Washington to using ground troops in this fight, so there's been really little progress, almost a stalemate going on for at least months, Anand.
Right, Jim, looking at the U.S. response, last week U.S. President Barack Obama, he agreed to send an additional 450 advisors to Iraq. How will this change the fight there?
Well, the hope is that these advisors will help train more Iraqi fighters and more quickly so they can take on ISIL. The U.S. Defense Secretary Ash Carter spoke about this Wednesday on Capitol Hill.
ISIL's lasting defeat still requires local forces to fight and prevail on the ground. We can and will continue to develop and enable such local forces because we know from experience that putting U.S. combat troops on the ground as a substitute for local forces will not produce enduring results.
But in public and private here in Washington, officials simply feel the Iraqi military is essentially a disaster. They lack the skills, means, or determination to take on the Islamic State. Even with 450 more U.S. trainers in the mix, it's doubtful that's going to change anytime soon, Anand.
Thanks, Jim. That's CCTV's Jim Spellman reporting.